Good evening, everyone. So tonight we are beginning with our third class in our series Out of Egypt. We have discussed at great length and with a lot of perspective and meaning the circumstances surrounding the Jews coming down to Egypt, their situation in Egypt, the slavery. Last week we delved quite deeply into the life of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, the individual who became the leader of the Jewish people. And if you remember last class, for those of you who were on last class, or if you listened to the recording, the idea that we ended off with was the first time that Moshe came to Paro and the first engagement that he had with Paro following his mission that he received from God, which was to tell Paro to let the Jews go. Paro's first reaction was to make the slave labor even more intense and even more difficult. So, where we are now in the story and where we're going to focus is that point where it became so dark and so difficult. And now the redemption is about to dawn, and the first cracks of light begin to shine through. And this is where we are in the story of Parshat Va'era, actually, to put it in context of the Torah. The story that we are in now is the second Torah portion in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus. And this is where our story begins. This is where we begin tonight with the start, the first glimmers of redemption. Now, the Jewish people were truly suffering. And the vast majority of the Jews were not only slaves, but they had been born into slavery. They were going into the 210th year since the beginning of slavery, which tells us that the adults of the time had been born into this slave mentality, this slave lifestyle, this suffering, the challenge. And I want to imagine for a group of people who live a life that is so bitter and they don't even know any other life. As much as they wish they would not be in pain, it's also very scary for someone to come and say, you're going to be redeemed, you're going to be freed. Because what does that even look like? What is this alternate lifestyle even going to be? How would it feel to live a life of freedom if you've never known anything else? And there's a wonderful story, a parable that's brought down to explain this concept. In the shtetl, which is the term for the small towns in Russia and across Eastern Europe, there was a paritz. Now, a paritz is a landowner, and the paritz had a lot of different properties on his land, and he would rent out to different people. And he had an inn that was on his land. And there was a Jewish family that served as the innkeepers. And every month they had to pay a certain amount of rent, which they were able to pay because of the income that they made from their inn. And they always knew that the paritz was not a good guy and they didn't want to get on his bad side. And they always knew that if they couldn't pay the rent, there was always the threat of being thrown into a dungeon. And it was a very brutal winter and there were not a lot of guests traveling. And it was 1 month that they weren't able to make their rent. And the paritz comes to collect his rent. And the Jew says, I'm sorry, please give me another few weeks to come up with the money. And he says, I'm giving you 1 more month and you're being thrown in the dungeon. And he wasn't able to come up with the money. And he and his family were thrown into the dungeon. And it was just a huge cavernous tunnel underground where every day food was lowered into the ground. And his family was languishing in the dungeon. And every day he would sit with his children and he would encourage them. And he and his wife would tell them, don't worry, one day we'll come out and we'll see the sun. And time is passing. And unbeknownst to them, there was a new family that took over the inn, another Jewish family. And that family met the same fate when they couldn't pay the rent one month. And all of a sudden, there are guests in the dungeon. Another family is now in the dungeon. And now there are two families in the dungeon. And of course, they had already fashioned some walls and some partitions, and they were living somewhat in the dungeon. And every day they would tell their children, one day you'll see the sun. Years pass, and now there's two families living in the dungeon. The children are grown, and the daughter from one family married the son from the other family, and life's happening in the dungeon. And the next generation is living in the dungeon, and this is their life. And the grandparents and the parents who remember life before this, every day they tell their children and they talk about one day we'll see the sun. We'll see the sun one day. Time passes, huge amounts of time, and every day this is their norm. The grandparents already passed on. The parents are now the grandparents, and the next generation is born. And every day, these young children hear their parents telling them, one day you'll see the sun. They have no idea what the sun is. They're living in a dungeon. They don't know any different. And one day, a man comes into the dungeon and he says, I am the grandson of the pirates who threw your grandparents inside. Interested in bringing you food every day for years already. Let me take you out. And they're so afraid. Where are you taking us? This is our safe space. This is our home. Where are you taking us? And he says, where am I taking you? You want to stay here? Come, let me take you out. You'll see the sun. And as soon as they heard those words, they said, oh, we'll be fine. Because they remembered that their grandparents used to tell them those exact words. One day you'll see the sun. And that made them trust that this man was taking them to a safe place. Now, when we hear the story of the family in the dungeon, we think, are they crazy? They wanted to live in the dungeon? Because we know what it's like not to live in a dungeon. We know what it's like to live in the sunlight. We know what it's like to live as free people, thank God. But in Egypt, the Jews didn't really know. The only message that they had were the words that Joseph had told the Jews before he passed on. When Joseph told his brothers and his children and his grandchildren, the Hebrew words, Pakod yifkod Elokim etchem, which translates that God will surely remember you. When Joseph promised that even though you'll become slaves, God will remember you and take you out of the land. And the words pakod yifkod are not the typical Hebrew phrase for remembering. It's a unique terminology. And this was the code that the Jews kept that reminded them. And when Moshe came now to the Jewish people, telling them that he was going to redeem them, he said those exact words. And that's why the Jews believed him. So the Jews put their faith in him, knowing that this was not an imposter. This was not someone who was coming with false hopes dangling in front of them. This was the real deal. So when things got even worse, as we discussed last week, they were so distraught because they had put their trust in Moshe. And that's when God tells them, keep the faith. Keep your trust in Moshe, because this is the plan. This is where it's going to start. And now the Jews are struggling, but they're holding on because they know that one day we'll see the sun. Well, now is when we're going to see the sun. And now is when the sun starts rising. And Moshe comes to Paro and he warns him of an incoming plague. And Pharaoh looks at him like, are you crazy? Get out of here. You think you're going to come threaten me about a plague? Really? No. But what's interesting to note is where the warning took place. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as their deity. They looked at the Nile River as the source of life, the source of their blessings, and the God was the one that created the Nile and gave the Nile powers. Now, Pharaoh had convinced his nation that he was the God that created the Nile. And he held himself to the standard of being a deity. Now, if he's a god, then he doesn't have human bodily functions. So what would he do? He didn't want anybody to know that he was a human being. So every morning, early in the morning, he would go down to the Nile to have a private time in the Nile. And what the Egyptians understood that to mean was that God's going to talk to his minion over there. So God is talking to the Nile. What was he actually doing? Using the bathroom. Simply because he didn't want anybody to know that he was a human being. And that's where Moshe met him, at the Nile. Basically, Moshe was telling him, I called your bluff. You are no God. You think you can pretend to be a deity? I'm coming to meet you right here when you're ready to go to the bathroom and perform your bodily functions, because you're a human just like anybody else. And you're definitely not a human with moral values. And Moshe tells Pharaoh, there will be a plague. And for 3 weeks, Moshe warned Pharaoh that God will send a plague if you don't allow the Jews to leave. And every morning, Pharaoh is annoyed at Moshe, uncomfortable that he's coming to him in this undignified way, and really not interested in listening to anything he has to say. Now, the first plague, which, unmute yourselves, what was the first plague? Anybody know?
Dam.
Very good. Dam. The first plague was the plague of blood. The plague of blood was not coincidental. In fact, all of the plagues were extremely strategic and had meaning and had purpose. But the first thing that God did was make the God of the Egyptians lose all credibility and power. And the entire Nile River was transformed into blood. Now, how did this plague come about? Moshe and Aaron, his brother, came to the Nile, and God instructed them to raise the staff and hit the Nile River. Now, Moshe didn't want to hit the Nile River, which teaches us a profound lesson. Aaron was the one who hit the Nile River. Why didn't Moshe hit the river? Because the river had protected him when he was a baby. The river had saved his life. And to show gratitude towards the river, Moshe would not hit the very thing that had protected him, which is a beautiful lesson in appreciation and being present enough to value those that are there for us, even something as specific as an object or as any type of nature, to appreciate what it does for us, whether it's walking outside in the rain and appreciating the fact that the rain refills our reservoirs of water, or that makes the grass grow, or standing in front of the mirror and thanking and appreciating our bodies for giving us the ability to do all of the things, or saying a blessing on our food, because we're appreciative of the food that nourishes us and God who gave us the food. It is immensely, immensely important to appreciate and show gratitude and not, God forbid, the opposite, to abuse those, definitely not people, but even objects and natural forms that have done good for us. And so Aaron hit the water, and the water transformed into blood. Now, this was not just water that was red. This was actually blood, thick, smelly, without enough oxygen to give life. And all of the sea creatures were unable to survive. And the land was immediately filled with an incredibly powerful stench of blood and of dead fish. And the Egyptians were freaking out. I mean, to put it in our words, right? They were going crazy. And it wasn't just the Nile River that transformed into blood. Every single liquid in all of Egypt turned into blood, which means that in their kitchens, in the bathrooms, in the showers, it says the bathhouses, every single form of liquid, the moisture in the air was bloody. There was blood coming out of the trees. Every bit of moisture turned into blood. And it became very, very dire because the Egyptians were suffering from dehydration. Where was there clear water? For the Jews in the land of Goshen. The water was completely clear. And as soon as the Egyptians realized that the Jews had fresh water, they came running to steal their water. But as soon as an Egyptian took the water, it transformed into blood instantly. Even if they were drinking out of the same cup, for the Jew, it was water, and for the Egyptian, it was blood. And they couldn't figure out what to do. Now, this automatically gave the Jews an upper hand because the Jews are, enjoying their fresh water and the Egyptians do not. And the Jews offered to sell the Egyptians water. And the only way the Egyptians were able to have clean, fresh water was if they would pay the Jews. Now, it's not true that Jews control the economy. But in that particular time, the Jews controlled the economy. They hiked the price of water so high in an effort to recoup all the losses for all the years of slavery. God was giving the Jews a chance and an opportunity to acquire their own wealth because the Jews had no money of their own because they were slaves. So this automatically shifted the dynamic, and the Jews were no longer slaves because the Egyptians had to pay them in order to have water, in order to survive. And this marked the end of the Jews actually being slaves. And from the plague of blood, the Jews were no longer forced to live as slaves. And it was 1 week of torture, of extreme lethargic feelings because the water in every Egyptian's body also turned to blood. So they were extremely heavy and unwell. And the only bit of water that they had was the ones that they had to pay a lot of money for. And this plague lasted for an entire week. After the week, the Nile started turning back into water. Now, it didn't happen immediately, and it certainly wasn't fresh water. It was still very smelly, and they had to go through a process of repurifying it, and they had to dig around new wells in order to find clean water. And this was the beginning of the Egyptians' downfall. Now, automatically, once the Jews saw this happening, this bolstered their faith in God. This gave them the confidence. And this plague got the Jews onto the path of becoming free. And the Egyptians were now lowered in their, fancy position of being the masters. And the Jews gained a little bit of their own autonomy. But after a week, Pharaoh said, 1 second, This was just some sort of magic. Egypt is known for its sorcery. We can also turn water into blood if we want to. Okay, so Moshe is a really good magician, but we can also do magic. I'm not letting the Jews go just because they performed some sort of magic. We found water. Okay, we had to pay, whatever. There was a crisis. There was a natural crisis, and that's it. Of course, that wasn't the case, but Pharaoh wasn't ready to admit it yet. And that's when God told Moshe, go warn Pharaoh of the next plague. The next plague, the warning this time took place in the palace so that all of the advisors would see and everyone in Egypt would know that it was coming, and Pharaoh wouldn't be able to say, I had no idea what happened. So it took place in the palace. Moshe came to the palace, and for 3 weeks, he would show up, warning Pharaoh that there would be another plague if he doesn't let the Jews go. And Pharaoh said, go away. I am not interested. You're not leaving. Stop telling the Jews what to do. The Egyptians were trying to get their slaves back, and now there was becoming this, turmoil in Egypt. And lo and behold, 3 weeks later, they're back at the Nile. And again, Aaron hits the Nile. And an enormous frog emerges from the water. Now, the term frog is used. There are other opinions that say this was another sort of amphibian creature, whether it was a crocodile or an alligator or something of that nature. And it was certainly a very dangerous looking frog. And it was huge. And it started lumbering towards the palace. Now, the Egyptians got very scared. So they started hitting it. And every time they hit it, it would just spout more and more frogs. And very quickly, the entire Egypt was swarming with frogs. Now, this plague, like the previous one, was part of the strategy to prove that God controls the world and that God exists. Because the Egyptians did not believe in God's existence. The Egyptians believed that the Nile River was their God. But now that the Nile has no control over these plagues, because the plagues are being starting from the Nile is the source of these plagues, they would lose their faith, so to speak, in their deity and be forced to recognize that God controls what they presume to be the deity. Now, this was also, from a military standpoint, an excellent strategy. Because if you're trying to weaken the enemy, the first thing you do is cut off the water supply. That's the first thing. The first thing you do is cut off the water supply. The next thing an army does before they start war is sound the trumpets, scare them with loud noises. And this was the biggest challenge of the second plague. It wasn't even the frogs as much as it was the noise level. The croaking of the frogs was so loud that it drove the Egyptians mad. They were not able to sleep. They weren't able to function. They couldn't handle the noise level. And incredibly, there was no problem for the Jews. It was almost like every Jew had like like the soundproof earphones, when you put it on and all the sound is muffled. That's how it was for the Jews. But the Egyptians were suffering from this terrible, terrible noise. And it was extremely uncomfortable. It was also very gross. The frogs got into the food. It was very slimy. It was very, very, very disgusting. We're not going to get into all of the details because I do want you to be able to sleep tonight. But this was the Egyptians' punishment. And it was actually exactly measure for the way the Egyptians had treated the Jews. The Egyptians had thrown the Jewish babies into the Nile and caused bloodshed through the Nile. So the Nile turned into blood. The Egyptians would wake the Jewish slaves up early in the morning with very, very loud noises just to torture them. And so this was measure for measure. God said, you don't let my children sleep, I ain't letting you sleep. And let me tell you, there are a lot of unpleasant ways to be woken up. Loud noises in your ears is by far one of the most unpleasant. Unless, of course, it's your child's voice. She's sitting right here. Then it's not terrible, but it's still startling. And when it's a loud, jarring noise that jolts you out of a very, very minimal amount of sleep, it's so, so difficult. And that's what the Egyptians put their slaves through. And that is what the Egyptians suffered through in the plague of frogs. And then it ended. And there were dead frogs piled up all around Egypt. And you can only imagine the state of Egypt right now. The empire that was on top of the world is now very poor, very, very uncomfortable because of the smell. And now there's just green slime. And I don't mean slime that you make as a craft, I mean frog slime all over Egypt, swarms of dead frogs just piled up everywhere. It was very uncomfortable for the Egyptians. And the Jews, because the Egyptians were so caught up in their own difficulties, the Jews were able to start slowly making their way back to Goshen, which was the Jewish land in Egypt, the Jewish area where the community was based out of. And slowly but surely, while the plagues were happening, simultaneously, the Jews were becoming more acquainted with Jewish values. Now, the Jews as slaves had always, always kept the kernel of faith that kept them going. They kept the Jewish language, they kept their Jewish names, and they kept their Jewish mode of dress as much as they could. But they didn't know much about Jewish traditions. In fact, the men were not even circumcised because they had been born into slavery. They didn't have a chance to keep Shabbat. They didn't have a chance to, eat kosher. They were living as slaves. They didn't have free choice. So during this time period, the tribe of Levi, the Levites, who were not slaves during this entire time, they were teaching the rest of the Jewish people all about the Jewish traditions and slowly but surely bringing them closer to their heritage. And now that the plague of frogs had ended, it was time for a third plague. And after each plague, Pharaoh said, I'm not letting you go. And this time God said, if he didn't listen to 2 warnings, he doesn't deserve another warning. And the third plague came as a surprise. This time, Moshe and Aaron were instructed once again to take the stick. Aaron hit the sand, and the sand formed like a cloud. You know, when you hit the sand and it comes up in like a cloud? Every kernel of sand turned into a bug. And all of the sand became lice. And the entire land was swarming with lice. Now, remember why Moshe didn't want to hit the water? Well, Moshe didn't want to hit the sand either. Can anybody guess why? I'm going to quiz you on what we learned in our last classes. Why didn't Moshe hit the sand? Does anybody know? You got to unmute yourself if you want to share your answer. Anybody? All right. So it was for the same reason of appreciation. There was something that the sand had done for Moshe, and in appreciation of that, Moshe did not want to hit the sand. What did the sand do for Moshe? Well, if we remember, when Moshe had gone out to help the Jews and he had seen a Jewish man being beaten by an Egyptian man, and he killed the Egyptian man, what did he do? He buried him in the sand. So the sand hid the evidence of Moshe's act. And because the sand had hid his evidence, Moshe did not hit the sand, and Aaron did it in his stead. And the land was swarming with lice, and the lice were attacking the people. The lice were embedding themselves in the skin and the hair. It was extremely, extremely painful. And this was also measure for measure, because the Egyptians did not allow their slaves to bathe. And so they were infested with lice on the regular because they weren't able to bathe themselves properly. And because the Jewish slaves had to suffer with lice, God made the Egyptians suffer with lice as well. And this plague again lasted for 1 week. And then the plague ended. And even though the lice was removed, the Egyptians had scars and skin problems for many, many months after, even once the plague was over. Now, this was the first set of plagues. The plagues are divided into 3 sets. This was the first set. And this was a group of plagues that was targeting the water and the earth. Targeting the water and the earth to send Paro and the Egyptians the message that God is the creator of the world, that God created the earth, the waters, and all of the Egyptian deities were either water or idols that were fashioned from sand or cement or stuff from the earth. And God was making it clear to the Egyptians that all of their deities were worthless and that God is the creator of the world and that God exists. Now, these 3 plagues might have been enough, but Pharaoh said no. Pharaoh was not interested in sending the Jews out of Egypt. And that was when he needed another warning. And this begins the second set of plagues. Now, the second set of plagues targeted the animals and the people. It targeted the animals and the people in a way that would prove to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh that even though God's presence is divine and is heavenly and cannot be seen in this world, God exists in the world, and that God has a direct authority over his creations, the people and the animals. And that it's not just that, okay, God created the world, but actually God has authority over everything in the world, not just like an artist that created a painting and left it on the wall, but rather that God is actively involved in our lives at every single moment. And this was the message that God would teach the Egyptians, and the message that God would empower the Jews with by giving their enemies these next 3 plagues. And from a military standpoint, the water supply was already attacked. The noise level was already very, very high. And the lice were kind of like arrows that were being thrown into the city from far, because the lice were swarming through the city, through the air, kind of like arrows. And now there was an all-out attack. Now God called in the reinforcements. And God sent a super exotic mix of wild beasts. And this was something that the Egyptians were not expecting, because this was extremely miraculous. This plague took on an otherworldly form, because the animals came from all over the world and were attacking the Egyptians and were breaking their homes and were killing and maiming all of the Egyptians. And God did not want to inconvenience the animals because God was bringing the animals out of their homes to do him a favor, essentially. And the animals were coming to do God a favor. And God wanted the animals to be very, very comfortable. Now, Egypt is a desert. And if you bring a bunch of polar bears into the desert, they're going to be highly uncomfortable. So God miraculously made each animal have its natural habitat surrounding him. So whenever there was an animal that was from a cold climate, it was freezing in that area. And if it was an animal that thrives in a tropical rainstorm, there was a tropical rainstorm when that animal was attacking. So the weather was abnormal because God wanted to make the animals comfortable because the animals were God's, platoon of soldiers that were coming to carry out God's decree. And this attack on the Egyptians was again measure for measure because the Egyptians would force the Jews to duel with wild animals for sport. And this was obviously very dangerous, and the Egyptians would have a kick out of it. And because of that, these wild animals came to attack the Egyptians. Now, something very, very interesting happened because, of course, many of the Egyptians were killed or injured or their homes were destroyed. But not only that, many Egyptians at this plague went completely insane, literally, because of the fear, because the animals were so foreign and scary looking, and it frightened them to such a degree that many of them really, truly lost their minds. And the aftermath of this plague was a lot of lives of the Egyptians lost, many, many injured, and many who were no longer able to return to normal mental capacity. And this plague, again, lasted for 1 week. And at the end of this plague, it was already 4 months into the beginning of the plagues. And the Jews were slowly but surely growing in their connection to God and gaining an incredible confidence because they were watching God stick up for them and punish their attackers who had made their lives miserable for so long. And it's interesting to note that the plagues that God sent the Egyptians were not random. And that's what's so important. God wasn't just getting creative. God was teaching very specific lessons within each plague. And this plague was the first time that Paro starts negotiating with Moshe. Paro calls to Moshe and he says, okay, what do you need? Seriously, what can we do to make this stop? And Moshe says, well, here's what we want. We want to leave Egypt. We want to go to the desert and we want to serve our God. And Paro says, okay, let's compromise. You want to serve your God? No problem. Serve your God here in Egypt. We won't stop you. We won't hurt you. Serve God in Egypt. And Moshe says, slight issue with that. Number one, we can't serve God in a place that is full of idolatry. It's very impure over here. And number two, the way that we serve God is by offering animals as sacrifices. But the Egyptians worshipped certain animals. And if they see us slaughtering their deities, they're going to attack us. It's not a good plan. You got to let us go. Pharaoh said, no, not happening. Sorry. Okay, well, this plague is not going away on its own. So Pharaoh said, okay, so pray to God that the plague ends and then I'll let you go. Moshe agreed. He prayed that the plague would end. And as soon as the plague ended, Pharaoh said, sorry, changed my mind. Now, interesting that remember when the frog plague ended and there were dead frogs all around Egypt? This time, the animals didn't die. The animals just went right back to where they came from. And there are two reasons for this. First of all, God didn't see any reason to kill the animals. They lived lives previously. Let them go live their lives. The frogs had been created for the express purpose of the plague. So their mission in this world was completed after the plague. But the animals had been living on the land and there was no reason for them to die. And also, God didn't want that the Egyptians would use the animal hides and the fur for, to rebuild their homes, to create anything, to have any type of pleasure. So the animals all left. And Pharaoh said, okay, they left as quickly as they came. We're good. You're not going anywhere. Now, Moshe said, well, there's going to be another plague coming. And then came another warning. And that is when the plague of pestilence arrived. Now, this plague really, really hit the Egyptians hard because they had no money left. After the plague of blood, they had no money. But they did have livestock. And their livestock was their only value. And the livestock all died. All of the livestock became diseased and they died. Now, the only caveat for this plague was something that Moshe told the Egyptians. Moshe warned Pharaoh in front of everyone, and he said, there's going to be a plague, and all of the livestock that is outside in the field is going to die. So all the cattle, all the horses, specifically because Egyptian horse trade was very, very, very big. All the horses, all the sheep, all the goats, everything in the field is going to die. Now, there were some Egyptians who believed Moshe. Pharaoh and the advisors were trying to encourage everybody to disregard. But there were some Egyptians that believed Moshe, and they said, well, Moshe said that all of the animals in the field are going to die. So they brought their animals into the house. And this demonstrated a glimmer of belief and faith on their part. And the animals that had been brought into the house did not become disease-ridden, and they did not die, which was proving to the Egyptians that this was true. What Moshe was saying was real. This was the hand of God. And this started stirring the feeling of revolt, the feeling of civil unrest, because now the Egyptians were starting to realize that their leader could make this stop, and he's not doing it. That Pharaoh could stop them from suffering, and he's choosing not to because of his own selfishness. And for 7 days, all of the animals were dying out. And once again, Pharaoh asked Moshe to stop the plague, and the plague stopped. And now, after another 2 warnings that were not heeded, the next plague came without warning. And this plague began with tremendous miracles, but this time it hit the people. Moshe took a handful of ashes from a furnace. And the commentaries tell us that there were 2 miracles that happened. Number 1, he was able to fit in one hand 4 handfuls worth of ashes. Now, if you pick up a bunch of sand in your hand, you can fit one handful in your hand. But Moshe and his brother Aaron each took two handfuls. And then Moshe put all of it into one hand, and it all fit. He was able to grasp it. Not only that, but the second miracle was that when he threw it, it spread and settled over the entire land of Egypt. Now, even if he had the best throwing hand, it was obviously a miracle that the ashes settled on every single surface on the entire land of Egypt. And every person who came in contact with that dust from the ashes of the furnace, their skin broke out in terrible boils. And there were actually 24 different types of skin diseases that that were inflicted upon the Egyptians. And each one had a different type of cure, but they were conflicting cures. So whatever salve would help one boil would make the other one worse. Whatever type of medication they would use for one type of problem would make the other one worse, which effectively meant that there was no cure. And the doctors were unable to do anything. And there was no way for the Egyptians to get comfortable. They couldn't sit, they couldn't stand, and it was very, very painful for them. And this, again, was measure for measure, because the Egyptians would inflict terrible pain on their slaves, and they didn't allow them to seek medical attention. They didn't allow them to treat their wounds. So God gave them wounds that were untreatable for them to understand the feeling that they had given the that they had given the Jews. And this was once again 1 week of agony. It was extremely painful for the Egyptians, particularly the ones that were hit the hardest by this plague were the sorcerers in Egypt. The sorcerers in Egypt had played a very vital role in diminishing the influence that Moshe had. Because at the beginning of the plagues, the sorcerers would copy whatever Moshe did, and they would say, he's just the sorcerer. And so God made them suffer from the plague of boils for the rest of their lives. The sorcerers never recovered from this plague, and they were unable to stand. For the rest of their lives, they had boils even at the bottom of their feet. They were unable to stand. And this was their punishment for undermining Moshe and effectively undermining God's influence. And for 1 week, again, the Egyptians were suffering terribly from these boils. And at the end of the week, the Egyptians' wounds started healing. Now, it's important to know that when the plague ended, it doesn't mean that the boils went away. It just means that they stopped getting new lesions. But it took a long time, and it was only at the end of the plague that the cures started working slowly and the salves started working and they started to slowly heal. But it was a long process. And this brings us to the end of the 6th plague. And during this time, the Jews were at a pinnacle of confidence. They're getting to that point. And the Egyptians are becoming less and less important, less and less powerful. And there's this shift in dynamic that is slowly making its way. And the end of the 2nd set of plagues asserted God's authority over the world. And then came the 3rd set of the plagues, which was focused on the heavens. And that was when God was teaching Paro that everything is godly, that there is no difference between the heavens and the earth. You can't say that God resides in the heaven and the earth is controlled by earthly beings. No. God can turn the heavens into the earth, and God can change the heavens and control the atmosphere and the air in a way that directly affects everyone here on earth. And that was when God sent the plague of hail. Now, the plague of hail was a very unique, miraculous plague. Moshe warned Paro once again at the Nile River. For 3 weeks, Paro said no, as he always was, saying yes and then flip-flopping back to no. And the hail started raining down on the Egyptians, but this was no ordinary hail. It was ice with a flame of fire inside the ice. So it would come crashing down on the houses, and the houses would burst into flame, destroying the trees, destroying the produce, destroying the homes, destroying people. And this is not naturally possible because fire and water do not coexist. And our sages tell us that the same way God gave fire and water the natural attributes that they cancel each other out, that water extinguishes a fire and fire melts ice, the same way God gives each element of nature its attribute, God was able to suspend those attributes for the sake of this plague. And so the ice did not extinguish the flames, and the flames did not melt the ice. It was hot fire inside a cold ice cube. The only thing that makes me think that there's any resemblance to that, has anybody ever seen deep fried ice cream? Makes no sense. There is a way to do it, but it makes no sense. And it melts in an instant. But there is a way to deep fry ice cream. So now imagine the opposite of that. Not hot, deep fried on the outside with ice cream in the middle. The opposite. Ice on the outside with fire in the middle. That's only something God could do. And the flames were destroying while the ice was pelting the Egyptians with this otherworldly, miraculous hail. And once again, Pharaoh starts negotiating with Moshe. And he says, okay, so you need to leave, right? Okay, so I'm going to let you go. But only the men can go. And Moshe says, sorry, we're going to leave with the men and the women, our sons and our daughters, our families, our possessions. We are not just going temporarily. Sorry, not happening. And Pharaoh says, but just let the men go. He wanted to make sure that they would come back. They would never leave their families behind. And Moshe said, no way. We are all going together. And Pharaoh said, okay, no deal. But please, please, please pray to God that it should stop. And Moshe said, well, you want it to stop. You know what you need to do. He said, okay, I'll let you go. I'll let you go. And Moshe prayed to God and the plague stopped. And once again, Pharaoh said, nope. Quite the opposite of, when kids say no trade backsies? Well, this was yes, trade backsies. I take it back. I take it back. And he changed his mind. Now, this flip-flop that Pharaoh was doing was God forcing Pharaoh to say no. In fact, it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And this was actually a punishment. There were so many opportunities that Pharaoh had to be kinder to the Jews, to be less cruel, to be to inflict less pain. And because he never took any of those opportunities to make the right choice, God actually took away his power of choice as a punishment for the fact that he had not used the ability to make the right choice for the sake of the Jews. And then came the swarm of locusts. And for anyone who just wants to know the Torah portion context, the 7 plagues that we just discussed are in the second Torah portion. And the 8th plague that we're about to start, that's already in the next Torah portion, just in case you wanted to have that context. And the 8th plague was a swarm of locusts that was brought in from a breeze. Again, God showing the Egyptians that God controls what comes from the heavens, what comes from the winds, and the locust breached every wall and ate up every single bit of produce that was starting to grow. The hail had destroyed everything that was already ripe. But now the locusts came in and destroyed the little crops that were starting to grow, effectively leaving the Egyptians with nothing to eat. And this was in response to the way that the Egyptians treated the Jews. The Egyptians took away every last morsel of Jewish dignity of their slaves. And so God made the locusts eat away at the little tiny bits of anything that the Egyptians had, effectively leaving them in the same position that they had left the Jewish slaves with. And this was very challenging. And this was very, very demoralizing for the Egyptians. And then the plague ended. And then came the 9th plague. And the 9th plague was the plague of darkness. Now, this was the end of the plagues already. And if we look at it from a military strategy, it was kind of like taking captives. God was holding the Egyptians captive for a short amount of time. And this plague lasted for 6 days. And during the first 3 days, it was a very thick darkness. The Egyptians were unable to see. There was no way to even get used to the dark. You know, when you are plunged into darkness, you shut the lights. For the first few seconds, you can't see anything, but then your eyes adjust. This was not a darkness that the Egyptians' eyes could adjust to. And the second 3 days, it became even thicker that the darkness could be felt. It took on a solid form, almost as if they were stuck in black clay and they couldn't change their positions. Whatever position they were in, they were stuck and they couldn't move. Now, during this time, the Jews were living in a different reality and having a very different experience. And the plague of darkness was an important time for the Jews, and it was also quite a tragic time for the Jews. Why was it a good thing? Well, the Egyptians had stolen all of the Jews' jewelry and riches and anything of that nature. And when the Jews would leave Egypt, they would want to take it back. But when they would go to the Egyptians' homes and they would say, "Give me back my jewelry, give me back my treasures, give me back my silver," the Egyptians would say, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any of your stuff." So during the plague of darkness, the Egyptians were unable to move, but the Jews had light. And so they went into the homes of the Egyptians and they searched through their stuff. Now, they did not take anything. They were not thieves, but they scouted out the locations of any riches that had originally belonged to them. And that way, when the Jews would leave Egypt, they would go to their former masters and say, give me back my jewels. And they would say, I don't have your jewels. They would say, yes, it's in the top drawer on the right side is my necklace. And on the bottom shelf of this cabinet, they knew exactly where everything was. So they were able to prove that they knew that it was theirs. And this happened during the plague of darkness. Now, during the plague of darkness, it was also a very tragic time for the Jews because God made it clear to the Jewish people from the start of the plagues that only those who had complete belief in God would merit to leave Egypt. And during these 9 months that the plagues were going on, the Jews were learning about their faith, they were learning about the Torah, they were learning about their connection with God and Jewish traditions, etc. But there were a lot of skeptics. And God sent a plague that unfortunately caused many Jews to pass away. And those who did not have complete faith in God didn't survive that plague. And they were buried during the time of darkness. Now, this was obviously a very sad time for the Jews because many people who did not have faith unfortunately perished. But God wanted to make sure that it wouldn't cause the Egyptians to rejoice in seeing that Jews were dying as well, because then they would think, oh, you see, the plagues are happening to the Jews as well. So God made it happen during the plague of darkness so the Egyptians would not see the Jews dying and being buried. And it wouldn't undermine the effectiveness of the plagues, which had the goal of boosting the power of the Jews and demoralizing the Egyptians completely. And after 6 days, the plague ended. And that's when God told Moshe, tell the Jews, the next plague that comes will be the plague with which the Jews will leave Egypt. And after the plague of darkness, Moshe said to Pharaoh, you got to let the Jews go. And Pharaoh said, no, don't ever come back to see me. And Moshe said, okay. Because if anybody knows the song, Pharaoh in pajamas in the middle of the night, you know that song? The next plague had Pharaoh running through the streets looking for Moshe. And that is where we will pick up next week, Bezrat Hashem. So next week, we're going to discuss the final plague and the actual exodus from Egypt. And I want to point out two things, besides for the incredible, miraculous nature of the plagues themselves and each lesson in and of itself. There's two things. First of all, for us to remember that every single thing that God does is purposeful and has a meaning and has a lesson. And also the idea of why did God send plagues to begin with? If God wanted to destroy the Egyptians, God could destroy them in one fell swoop and let the Jews out. But God didn't do that. God sent 9 plagues and then a 10th plague over the span of many months, each one in its own creative experience. And there's a reason for it. Firstly, because God wanted to teach the Egyptians lessons and teach the Jews lessons. And also because the Jews needed to see this and experience it over a certain amount of time to be able to get into the mindset of leaving Egypt. Because you can't just free someone from slavery and expect them to be free from the slave mindset. They needed time and step-by-step processes to be able to change their mindset and change their outlooks to be ready to live as free people and to be ready to make their own choices. Because when the Jews would leave Egypt, God would present them with a choice of keeping the Torah. And these people had never had the experience of making their own choice. And now you expect them to make a choice that will be life-changing for all of eternity? So they needed the time to lose the slave mindset. And this is a lesson for each one of us in our own lives as well, because we all have certain things that we are slave to, whether it's a bad habit, maybe it's our phones, maybe it's a toxic relationship, whatever it is, big or small, we all have something that we are a slave to it. And we think that, oh, I'm going to break that habit. And it doesn't happen in 1 minute. That's when we need to remind ourselves that it takes time. We need to take it step by step by step. We need to do small changes over significant amount of time in order to create lasting change. And that's what God was providing the Jews, the opportunity to create lasting change in their mindset. So on that note, Bezrat Hashem, next week we will delve into the actual Exodus when they walked through the gates and out of Egypt. And in the meantime, I want to urge each one of us to figure out what it is in our lives that we are a slave to, and figure out what kind of steps we need to take. Believe me, it's not blood, frogs, or lice, but what kind of steps we need to take for ourselves to be able to be free of that Egyptian mindset, that slavery mentality. So if anyone has any questions, Mashi and I will be happy to answer them. Ready to go into your bed? Yes. Okay.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. One of the
yes.
For the past week, I've been trying to. I have this quote that I love, and I couldn't figure out from which parsha I got it from. And your class now has reminded me where it comes from. When you spoke about animals and people, how God used that as a way to prove that God is in the world. So there's a quote that I have to remember where I heard it from, but he's essentially showing, people that are very intellectual from university sometimes feel that they know more than religious people. But anyways, long story short, the quote is, it's kind of a rabbi speaking to somebody from Cambridge. And the quote goes, you're from Cambridge and you know that God exists. No, you're from Cambridge. You know that the world exists, therefore you seek to understand God. I am from Yeshiva. I know that God exists, therefore I seek to understand the world.
That's a great
and
quote.
It was just
I don't know the rabbi who said it, but it's a wonderful quote. And it actually boils down to, do we believe in God because of the world, or do we look at the world through the lens of our belief in God?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that God created the world with the Torah tells us that we need to look into the Torah to understand the world rather than the other way around. So that's a great quote. Thanks for sharing that. Really nice. Sabrina, what did you want to ask? Yes.
Yes, I have to ask something. I don't know. I was just thinking, why all the plagues lasted 7 days and the last one that we were seeing lasted 6?
I'm so happy you asked. Actually, it was very strategic because God allotted a 1-week time period for each one of the plagues. And there were 7 days allotted for darkness. But God only put 6 of them upon the Egyptians in Egypt, because fast forward the story, when the Egyptians drowned in the sea, later on, they were hit with a plague of darkness in the sea for 1 day. So God kind of like reserved one day of darkness for the sea.
The last straw. Okay, that's good.
Good question.
Nice. Thank you.
Sure. All right, ladies, thank you so much for joining us. God willing, next week, I hope to be back in person. For those of you who will be able to make it next week, Bezrat Hashem. And next week will be the last class in this series. So I'm really looking forward to having you all next week for our series finale. Next week is also Tu B'Shvat. So we will have a fruit platter at the class in addition to the cookies. So if you don't usually come, you definitely want to be there next week. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank